Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello and welcome to episode 93 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on a bright spring morning at a house in a provincial Russian town. Three sisters are preparing to host a lunch to celebrate the youngest sister's 20th birthday. The day also happens to mark exactly 1 year since their father's death, so the occasion is met with bittersweet feelings. Bittersweet for many reasons. The sisters and their only brother all long to trade the monotony of their provincial existence for the half-remembered excitement of Moscow, which they had left as a family 11 years previously. But their lives do not turn out as they hope. Weighed down by their own inertia and misplaced ideals and affections, they fail to lift themselves beyond the circumstances of their provincial existence. This is Anton Chekhov's Three Sisters, the third of his quartet of great plays written in the last years of his short life. Three Sisters is a challenging, dramatic masterpiece, a symphonic study of the search for purpose and love, and of profound personal disappointment. The musical extract we opened with was a brief bit of Chopin's Nocturnes for piano, which my guest today cited was a favorite of Chekhov's, and which provides a suitable soundscape for the Three Sisters' dreams and disappointments. We might even imagine Masha playing it. Three Sisters opened in January 1901 at the Moscow Arts Theatre, where his previous two major plays, The Seagull and Uncle Vanya, had been performed. The production was co-directed by the influential co-founder of the theatre, Konstantin Stanislavski, who also appeared in it, as did Olga Nippur, whom Chekhov had written the part of the middle sister, Masha, for, and whom he married that same year. As we record this episode, a spellbinding new production is opened in the Sam Wanamaker Theatre at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre here in London. The candle-lit stage of the Sam Wanamaker provides a transporting setting for the flickering dreams of the three sisters and their suitors. I'm absolutely delighted, therefore, to be able to talk today to the writer responsible for the translation of the play being performed at the Globe, Rory Mullarkey. Rory is an esteemed playwright in his own right, author of Pity, The Wolf from the Door, and Mates in Chelsea, all staged at the Royal Court Theatre, as well as St. George and the Dragon at the National Theatre and Cannibals Single Sex at the Royal Exchange in Manchester. Rory studied Russian at Cambridge University and has previously translated Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard, which played at the Bristol Old Vic and Manchester Royal Exchange. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Rory. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Douglas. I'm really thrilled to be here and talk about this amazing play.
Great. Now, you studied Russian at school and university and have traveled widely in Russia and translated plays from Russia. So my first question is, what is it about Russia and its drama that you're drawn to? And particularly, when did you first become interested in Chekhov?
Well, I was lucky enough to be able to study Russian at school, which is a pretty rare opportunity in the UK, but I went to quite a posh school and they offered Russian as a GCSE subject, so I picked it up when I was about 14 and immediately just fell in love with the literature. I think the specific dark tone appealed to me as a grumpy teenage boy growing up in northern England in the early 2000s. So I fell in love with Gogol and Pushkin and Lermontov and Dostoevsky and all of the great Russian 19th century literary masters. And I was also at the time really smitten with and taken by the theatre. I loved acting in plays. I wanted to be an actor. I did every school production possible. And so, in some ways, Chekhov was the ultimate marriage of those two big loves of my teenage years, the Russian literature and the theatre. Chekhov as the most esteemed Russian playwright, the second most performed playwright in the world after Shakespeare. So, reading these plays for the first time was just amazing for me. In Stockport, near Greater Manchester, there was a branch of the bookshop Borders, which had a little Starbucks in there. And on the weekends, I would go and take out a stack of books and go and read them in the stop because I couldn't afford to buy them. And I remember I read when I was about 15 or 16 Jean-Claude Van Italy's Broadway translations of Chekhov's plays, and it was sitting there in that cafe that I was just completely overwhelmed by them. And wanting to be an actor at the time, Three Sisters was actually the first one I read, and I was determined that I would immediately have to play Vershinin because I obviously thought that, as a 15-year-old boy, thought that he was a kind of smooth-talking ladies' man and didn't see the complexity or the darkness in that character.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You fell for him, did you?
I did. I completely fell for him. I was desperate to play him. I think as well, my dad was a lieutenant colonel in the artillery, like Vershinin, so I think there was probably some kind of strange Oedipal thing going on there, which I hadn't really realised at the time.
I could just see you in the Starbucks, actually. I'm an ex-bookseller, so I would have been frustrated by the idea that you took all these books and were reading them and wasn't buying them.
Yeah, no, I also wasn't buying any drinks from the cafe. I was just sitting there with a glass of water and all these books. They probably hated me.
No, that's great. You talk about your angst-ridden teenage years. I had the same it's probably a bit later, in my early 20s when I was at university, where I plowed through all of the Penguin editions of Russian classics, Dostoevsky, etc. I still have them on my shelf, and I keep looking at them sometime and think, will I ever go back to those? I don't know. But anyway, we do go back to Chekhov, and it's fascinating you say that about being second most performed, because he's not the easiest of playwrights or plays to like. And I think there are lots of people who would run a mile from going to a Chekhov play.
Yeah, I think he's got a slightly bad reputation of writing quite boring plays, which I think is completely false. But I think that's because they're largely domestically situated. They've got, speeches about, in this play, for instance, philosophy. And there's this sense of Three Sisters as this thing about gazing out of the window, yearning for a different kind of life that feels like it's oddly static, very bourgeois. And so people hold Chekhov up as this sort of standard bearer for very boring, staid, white middle class, historically accurate theatre. And I don't really think that's what he is or what he was doing at all. That's something that's been layered onto him, imposed on him by over a century of culture and productions. But yeah, I think what he was doing at the time was far more revolutionary, was modernist, and is also very funny and entertaining if you see it in the right production. So that was always what I found reading those plays, and what I loved about it, and what I hoped that I could convey doing my own translations of them.
That's brilliant. I mean, there is a tension, a well-addressed tension between the melancholy, or that the characters are always miserable, and the idea that they're supposed to be comedies. He called two of the plays comedies in their subtitles, and sometimes I think people miss that bit, but we'll come to some of that. For listeners who are not familiar with this play, or as a reminder, could you give us a brief introduction to the characters and the main events in the plot?
Yeah, of course. So, as you said in your own introduction, the three Prozorov sisters, Olga, Masha, and Irina, live in a provincial town in the middle of nowhere in Russia in around about 1900, and their brother is there too, Andrei, and it's a year since their father, who was the brigadier general of the artillery brigade stationed in the town, it's a year since he's died, and since then they've been kind of marooned there, hoping that they could get back to Moscow, which is where they were born and spent some of their childhood. Although the fact of Moscow, or whether or not their desire is realizable, is always in dispute in the play, particularly from the beginning for Masha, who is married to a local schoolteacher, and so has no sense that she will ever be able to really return there because her life is very much in this town where they now live. But anyway, they're hoping that Andrei, the brother, will get an academic post. That's at the beginning of the play. They're hoping he'll be employed as a professor at Moscow University, and that will enable them all to move back there, or all except Masha to move back there. And then the two things that really motor the plot, as you said, that begins Act 1 on St. Irina's Day, where they have a party, they've invited a bunch of guests around. And the two things that really change on that day and motor the story are, first of all, the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin, who is a new battery commander in the brigade. and he knew the sisters and their parents from Moscow. So he is a sort of outside herald of that different kind of life erupting into theirs. And there's the character of Natalia Ivanovna, or Natasha as she's called for short. Andrei is in love with her, and at the end of Act 1 proposes to her. And so these two things, Vashinin's beginning an affair with the married sister Masha, and Natasha's moving into the house, having children, and gradually taking over the house, are the two things which drive the plot forward. But of course, because it's a Chekhov play, it's not really so much about the beat-by-beat plot. It's more about the emotional thermodynamics that occur over this really quite long period of time, round about 4 years. You have these snapshots, and the photographic metaphor isn't an accident. You have these snapshots of them at different times. You've got the Saint's Day in Act 1, then nearly 2 years later, probably, Act 2 is the Lent Carnival in February. So Act 1 is in spring, Act 2 is in the winter. Act 3, again, probably just over a year after that, in summer, where there's been a big fire in the town, and the Prozorov household is serving as a kind of shelter for victims of the fire. And then in Act 4, the background event that drives the story is the departure of the brigade that Vashinin is in, and indeed all of the soldiers, because this is an ensemble play. There are 14 characters, and we really see what happens to each of their dreams and desires over the course of this 4-year period. And it's really that community of characters that gives the play its life and its character. Finding out how each of them has moved or changed is one of the things that propels our attention forward as audience.
That's a great summary. I love your phrase, the emotional thermodynamics of what's going on, because that is a lot of what's happening. Actually, the way you described it, it sounded like there was more plot than I'd remembered. But it doesn't feel like there's a hell of a lot happening somehow. Things happen in between, of course, and off stage. And we often seem to come back to the same sort of situation with the characters sort of caught in stasis in time. It's not explicit how long has actually gone by between each act, but time has passed. I mean, Natasha and Andrei have children in the interim, but also you have this sense of things not changing very much as well. And I go back to the theme about moving back to Moscow, which sisters talk about it often. And one wonders, in practical terms, their parents having passed, one assumes that they could choose to move. I mean, you mentioned Masha being married, but could they not sell the family house and go? So here's the big question. Why don't they just go?
It's such a fascinating question because Chekhov deliberately, as I think he does with everything he writes, the question is full of contradictions and paradoxes. There are lots of reasons why they could perhaps go. There are lots and lots of reasons why they couldn't. Because even with a materialist, literal reading of the text, these are women. I don't think it's accidental that they're 3 women. In the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it would be very difficult for them to go somewhere without some kind of male patriarchal figure. That's why they initially latch onto their brother, but at the end of Act 1, that becomes not a possibility because he's going to be married and he's going to stay. So for them to just move there as these single women and get jobs, how would they find a flat? It would be very difficult. So first of all, practically speaking, it's a really interesting question. Also, I think the other thing the play is kind of asking us or prodding is this sense of us making plans but not getting round to fulfilling them. Even if Moscow was relatively easy to get to, which, as I've just said, I don't think it was by the standards of the time, particularly for these single young women. It's the fact that moving their entire life is something that requires such an existential, such a spiritual effort. And the play is asking you at every turn, why aren't they doing it? And that's one of the reasons why it's so resonant, is because it allows us to think about our own regrets, our own missed opportunities, our own plans which we never fulfill, by showing us this supposedly simple task that nevertheless these people fail to achieve.
I think you're right. It's not actually as simple as all that, particularly as women. Chekhov said in a letter that the real-life town he had in mind was a place called Perm, which is 700 miles from Moscow, with no direct rail line, and it would take 2 days to reach Moscow. And Chekhov himself wrote the play when he was staying at Yalta because of his health, which is 1,300 miles from Moscow. There's always this sense, isn't there, that the idea of going to Moscow becomes a metaphor for a hope or a dream. And it's a pretty distant one. As I've just said, they're a long way from anywhere. Michael Frayn actually said in an introduction to his translation that the name of this town is Exile, which I thought was nicely put. And I read a wonderful line that answered the question by saying they don't get to Moscow because the play that they're in is about not getting there. It's about their failure to act, as you've said, their disappointments, their lack of agency. What are those reasons that they don't pursue it? And how do they feel about it when their dreams dry up?
Yeah, I mean, well, agency is a very modern idea in some ways, but it is very much the thing that I think the play centrally is questioning. It's asking how much of our own lives are we really able to control, and how much is about accidents, circumstances, contingencies. How much are we kind of caught in history and unable to affect any real change either in our own lives or to the world, or how much agency do we actually have? And creating this quite simple thing of these people who want to go somewhere but don't is a brilliant, hugely resonant, poetic manifestation of this idea and this discussion, and allows Chekhov to pose all these fascinating questions about human destiny and human agency.
Yeah, they definitely feel the weight of their circumstances and seem unable to surpass it.
Yeah, it's also important. I mean, I always hasten to say, because Moscow is currently the capital of Russia, I think we often impose a sort of capital city idea of it onto our reading of the play and think maybe London or somewhere is an equivalent. But actually, Petersburg, as it was called, was the capital of Russia at the time. So really, Moscow is more resonant as home.
And a return to their childhoods.
Yeah, to the past.
Yeah. Let's talk about the form of the play, because this is not a conventional action-driven drama. There isn't a single central, strong, progressive narrative. There are no central protagonists. As you say, multiple characters, each given their own meaningful story. As with Chekhov's other plays, as you also said, it's very much an ensemble piece. It feels very amorphous in structure, though, as well. People come and go in a sort of random rhythm, each with their own agendas, as we said, like particles, rarely colliding or connecting. Chekhov himself wrote to his wife as he was working on it that it was not a play, but a sort of mishmash. It's a bit of a misleading disavowal, though, isn't it, I think, because this formlessness is deliberate, is it not?
Yeah, I think it allows him to create this sort of, it's interesting you said symphonic, that's often how I think of it as well. It's kind of a symphonic poem or even a symphony. It is extremely musical, both in its language, but also if you think of each of the characters as an instrument, able to bring in themes or leitmotifs at various points, that's really what he's doing. He's sort of turning the volume dials up and down on these various people to create these sonic effects, but also because it's sonic effects through language, it's also this sort of image politics, this tapestry of ideas and complicating of the ideas that he's able to do across these 4 snapshots of time. So it really is, as well as being in some ways a sort of realist play, it also has this kind of tone poem quality to it. I agree with you that the other plays are ensemble plays, but I think there's a sort of central quartet of characters in both The Seagull and Uncle Vanya which really drive the audience attention. But in this one, it really is. It's his largest cast of main characters, and it's the play where there's no real character who has a much bigger part or a much larger amount of agency. I think because he's feeding into this theme of what agency is, of what our ability to impact our own lives is, and so he moves all of these 14 people across it, each with their own different relationship to the themes of the play and to the central ideals. They often repeat phrases across the play, repeat each other's phrases, but each of them has their own very specific, very highly honed internal life and attitude to these things. They're from different classes, different genders, different professions, and so we really do get this kind of polyphony of different thematic viewpoints. Chekhov sung in a choir when he was a boy, and I just think of it as a polyphonic choral piece. It feels like it's like Palestrina or something in how it's presenting itself formally as well as being quote-unquote realistic.
It's brilliantly described. I'm interested that you raised the question about realism, because I've read a range of views about whether Chekhov's plays fall under this label of naturalism or realism. And in the original production of the work, Stanislavski went to some lengths, I think, to dress the set, create a soundscape, established detailed psychological histories of the characters, etc., to make the whole more real in a sense. But there's a strong sense of detachment from reality at times that infuses the play. It's a sort of diffuse, impressionistic kind of feel to the whole. One critic called it postmodern, and it feels like there's no certainties or coherence. It's hard to pin it down.
I mean, it could be all of those. I feel like the meta-theatrics of it have a relationship with postmodernism. The way that he disintegrates character has this relationship with modernism. And of course, the sort of straightforward action of the play to a lot of people would feel like a kind of high naturalism. I'm sure Chekhov would have hated all of these generic terms being imposed on it for good reason. But when you're doing a production, you have to sort of hone in, especially with a text as rich and dense and deep as a play like this. You can never do everything. There's so many contradictions and ambiguities that, in fact, sometimes you're going to have to choose one thing over another. And I think what Stanislavski did very successfully by report was create a kind of identity for Chekhov's productions, which allowed the audience to watch them in a certain way and take in the themes. And that was very powerful. So although Chekhov had all his grumblings about how Stanislavski didn't understand the comedy and he was too concerned with doing the sounds of crickets in the wings and not concerned enough about the emotions of the characters or whatever, I feel like what Stanislavski gave was a vocabulary for the audience to be able to understand something of what Chekhov was doing. I don't think he did the definitive productions, but as with Shakespeare, there can never be definitive productions of things that are so rich and multifaceted and contradictory.
Well, I think, as I understand it as well, that some detailed understanding of psychological motivations in these characters is also correct, to avoid melodrama, to make it more real in that sense.
Yeah, definitely.
But I was also interested in the polyphony you describe. It seems very modern as well. It contributes to some degree to this sense of incoherence because the dialogue unfolds where it's not necessarily sequential or logical. Characters engage in this sort of desultory conversation, which is barely conversing because they don't really listen to each other very much or necessarily respond directly to what the previous person has just said. They're sort of in their own world, wrapped up in their own concerns. I read a phrase that described this as talking past one another. And that's quite disconcerting in form as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it can be disconcerting for an audience to engage with that. But I think, again, as with everything with Chekhov, it's also the opposite of that. They also do listen. There's one time in the play where Irina says, "Don't talk to me about love," and the next line from Tusenbach is, "I have this thirst," and it says the stage direction is not listening. I think that's the only time in the play where a character is actively described as not listening. A lot of the other time, they exist in this strange place where they're sort of saying their own thing in response to what the other character has just said. I often get accused of this by my wife. It's probably a very male thing to do, of waiting till the other person has finished speaking so I can make my point. And I think that a lot of the characters in this play, particularly the more loquacious male characters, are very much guilty of that. But at the same time, they all have this shared language. They all have these little shared phrases which come back. Often the next speech, even if it seems like they're not directly engaging with the point, will have some kind of lexical cue that suggests that actually they are listening, even if they're not responding. And that's kind of fascinating.
It may be more unconscious in a way sometimes because they do start talking about something completely different.
Yeah.
Irrelevant to what's been said just previously. You talked about in your preface to the text that when coming to translate the play, you started by identifying rhythm and sound as a priority.
Yeah.
And I wondered, what is it about this language, particularly this repeating of specific phrases? These phrases are poetic, but they also have a sort of dramatic or philosophical resonance. I mean, we talked about to Moscow. Obviously, they say that quite a lot. But there's this one particular phrase as well, which you translate as, "it makes no difference." Or in other translations, "it doesn't matter, it's all the same," which is said more than 30 times in one form or another, apparently, and by every major character at least once. So what is going on with this phrase? What is the import of this phrase, "it makes no difference"?
Well, for me at least, it's really a key into the questions and the themes of the play. It's the phrase that Chebotikin ends the play with, so it's the sort of penultimate line in the play. But also, yeah, as you say, it's repeated so many times that I really wanted to find a way of translating it that would allow the audience to hear those repetitions. That's why I went for "makes no difference," which feels like it pings out. But I think it's back to this crucial question of how much am I actually genuinely in control of my own life? How much do my actions have an effect on the world around me, on those around me, and on my own situation in the world? And this idea of making a difference or not making a difference is so crucial to what he's talking about and what he's doing in a kind of revolutionary dramaturgical sense. I mean, this play is so anti-Aristotelian It's not about one character who is a king or a nobleman with a desire to do a certain thing, trying to fulfill it. It's about this diffuse group of people, like kind of not really doing the thing that they want to do, or not getting round to doing the thing that they want to do. And I think in that sort of oppositional dramaturgy that he sets up, this idea of making a difference or not, that actually, as we move into the modern world, where there are things like, as Chebotikin keeps bringing in, the news from the outside, newspapers, mass media, we feel so surrounded by harbingers of our own powerlessness that to think of our lives as something that we can in some way have any effect over at all. And I think that's why makes no difference is this phrase, and it's repeated particularly at the end by Chebotikin, who has decided that things don't make a difference. He's retreated into an almost nihilistic position of, I don't have any control. It's no accident that he's the guy with the newspaper, reading about pandemics and things, and there is a smallpox epidemic in Sakara, Chinese Manchuria at one point in the play. So the outside world has just made him, and the inside world has made him feel so powerless over the course of the play. He's retreated into a sort of we're in a simulation type way of thinking about things.
But he's not alone, is he? I mean, they all say this almost casually, throw away in some way, but it's very telling. As you say, nihilistic. There's some sort of philosophical statement of resignation that whatever they feel or think or do, it will not change things, their lives. It won't be the answer to their hopes. It's pretty desolate. Or it could just be a devil may care, depending on how you deliver it, I guess.
Of course, because it's Chekhov, it's always the two things. It's always ambivalent. It always has this irony to it. It's never clear cut. He's not making any pronouncements or telling us that we need to think one specific thing or have this kind of takeaway conclusion from it.
I've got another rather nerdish question for you. You also say in your note on the text that many translators have shortened Chekhov's original long sentences, presumably to make the language sound more modern or fluent in English. But you said, for example, that you've retained Chekhov's common use of ellipses, where characters' speech pauses or trails off. So why are Chekhov's ellipses significant?
They're a really special thing to him. He uses ellipses in his prose as well, and he uses them in his letters. They're part of his musical vocabulary. There's a kind of an openness to what they're doing. Again, I think this question of possibility of all the different ways of interpretation is so crucial to Chekhov. He wants a bunch of thoughts to occur to you and for you to ask a bunch of questions. He doesn't want to close down possibilities of meaning to you. And the ellipsis as a break, as a pause, as a trailing off, as whatever you want it to be, can mean so many different things, and they mean different things in different characters' mouths. Perhaps different characters have different rhythms for their ellipses, but the fact that Chekhov puts them in so frequently, they're all over the play, and they're not in the dramatic topographical sense like some dramatists will say an ellipsis means a silence of this long, of 2 seconds or whatever. He's not interested in that. I think he's interested in how the performers and the director and ultimately the audience interpret these ellipses, and that for somebody who's so interested in dissonance or strange harmony, in creating effects through half thoughts and half memories, etc., I think they serve a really useful purpose for him as an artist.
It's fascinating having seen your reference to these. When I look at the pages of text, it's extraordinary how many there are.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah, and as you say, they create space for interpretation because characters can be brought up short, seen to reflect on what they've just said, or it may indicate that they weren't really committed to what they just said, or they were thinking of something else, or that they actually decide that they're not sure that what they just said they believe in, or they could be just taken somewhere else by what they've just said. It just gives so many opportunities to witness an emotional subtext, the inner thoughts going on in a character. And literally, they draw out time. Time passes differently. It takes longer. And time is a huge element in the play, isn't it? Because time passes between the acts, as we said at the beginning, and they're still in the same place. You also mentioned in your introduction Samuel Beckett, which seems on the surface somewhat surprising comparison, but like Vladimir and Estragon, for example, they all seem to be waiting for something to happen. They're filling in time, waiting. Is that how you see it?
I think so. I mean, it's the simple poetic action allows for these questions to be asked about agency and lack thereof. And in Beckett, it's waiting for someone who doesn't arrive. And in Chekhov, it's wanting to go somewhere but not going somewhere. In fact, Chekhov, amazingly, towards the end of his life, when he was still hoping to be able to write something else after The Cherry Orchard, just before he died, he said he wanted to write a play set in Antarctica, so in a wasteland, about two people waiting for someone who doesn't turn up.
Wow.
So I feel like there's a very direct relationship between what they're doing and also this sort of, as I was saying, anti-Aristotelian thing of, in a world where you're so aware, obviously Chekhov was at the time with the introduction of mass media, photography, etc., but Beckett even more so in the wake of World War II, how much horror there is in the world that you can't do anything about. And so to find a dramaturgy to talk about people's agency in the world that maybe isn't about a king fulfilling an action was their project. And I think that this play, particularly for him, of all his plays, is the one that throws down this gauntlet, which then Beckett picks up, and various other artists and writers do. This play does feel like this herald of the 20th century, this play about people becoming numbers somehow, becoming statistics. The play is called Three Sisters, and I think the question is, what would it be if there were two sisters? There's also a brother. Why isn't he mentioned? What do three people's lives mean in contrast to two or four? Obviously we have Stalin 50 or so years later saying one person's death is a tragedy, a million people's is a statistic. And I think that Chekhov he's in some ways feeling that this kind of thing is in the air. I wouldn't necessarily call him prophetic, but I think that any really good diagnosis is a prognosis, and I think that's what he's doing here.
Yes, when we looked at some of the previous plays, at Uncle Vanya, for example, there's this sense of a future coming that might sweep them all away in some way. And of course, he isn't to know the revolutions are just around the corner, but, with hindsight, we might think it prophetic. But in terms of time, there's a real sense of what it's like just to live within time, to be aware of it passing by, of being caught in repeating cycles of behavior, boredom, I think you said, of doing something and nothing at the same time.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that going on, which seems very like Beckett. And they also talk a lot about it with memories of the past and talk about the future, a future where they imagine a happiness they do not believe is possible now. And it's ironic with all of what you've just been saying about what is to come and what we know of what is to come. And when Vershinin says, in 200 or 300 years, life on Earth will be unimaginably beautiful. And they have some idea that that will happen because of their suffering and sacrifices now. It will be too late for them, but things will get better. And I've read some critics suggesting that Vershinin represents Chekhov's own view in this, that the future is bright. Not so sure. What do you think?
I think he was too good an artist to allow a character to be a straightforward mouthpiece for his own opinion. I think Vershinin's windbaggery is also underlined, his tendency to talk even when people don't necessarily want to hear him going on and on. Although what Vershinin says is often very moving and beautiful and exciting, for the characters on stage is also sometimes boring and weird and inappropriate. And the fact that Chekhov allows both of those things to be true means obviously, actors and directors have to make a bunch of choices to how they want to portray him. But I don't think that necessarily Chekhov is saying what his own view is. But I think all of this, the play, I do think is very autobiographical. He started writing a year after his own father died. As you said, he was in Crimea, kind of in exile, yearning for Moscow, and so much of that suffuses what he's doing here in the play.
But this idea of the future, if you give it an optimistic spin, it sounds somewhat like Obama's arc of history, bending towards improved standards and justice for everyone, though obviously that seems a bit hard to hold on to in our current times. And it is pretty hard to credit that these characters have any idea what the future brings. It seems a bit delusional and futile to contrive a narrative or meaning for your life in these terms at the moment, and because they actually do little about any of it as well. So it's hard to believe in as a philosophy, I would say. As you say, he qualifies the way Vershinin. And even Tuzenbach is smart enough to recognize that some material things will change, but life will still be the same. Human beings will still feel the same way. So there isn't just a paradise over the hill, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that he's attracted by this utopian idea, Chekhov as a person, but he's not necessarily willing to buy into it wholesale. I think the play is so interested in this idea of the present and what that means, to be present in the moment and to take things as they come, rather than either being stuck in some imagined future or mourning and miserable about the regrets of the past. I think the play is saying it is the hard, horrible work that every human has to do every single day is get up and exist now. If there is any possibility of hope or change, it will only come from an understanding of your own powerlessness, but also, nevertheless, with a big underline on the nevertheless, your desire to do something about it.
Yeah, don't give up. Although he wrote in his notebook one time, we struggle to change life so that those who come after us might be happy, but those who come after will say as usual, it was better before. Life is now worse than it used to be. But one of the solutions seems to be, as you've just said, hard work. Both Irina and Tusenbach talk about this idea of what we need is hard work, and that will make the difference, both for them and future generations. But again, it comes across as somewhat hollow because, Tusenbach is essentially independently wealthy. And then when Irina does get a job, surprise, surprise, she hates it. It's pretty hard.
Yeah. Again, it's Chekhov, so there's always some sort of paradox or some kind of contradiction. There's this thing that Brecht says in praising Bernard Shaw about he always puts the revolutionary idea in the mouth of the conservative, and that's what we have here. We have the one aristocrat in the play is the one who gets the closest to proselytizing revolution, and that automatically means that we have a kind of ambivalence as an audience towards it. This play has gone down very differently in different performances that I've seen in this production that we're doing at the moment. Sometimes it plays to silence, and sometimes there are big gales of laughter. On press night, Irina's talking about how she's 24 and she already feels like it's the end of her life. Got a big laugh because people can also see the naivety in that, but also it's very genuine and heartfelt for her in the moment. And I just think that is what's so extraordinary and magnificent about what Chekhov's done, is he's allowed it to be both of those things at the same time.
Yeah, that's great that you touch on this comedy, because I was going to come back to that. We've talked about Beckett, and Chekhov actually wrote at one stage that the play was very difficult to write. It turned out to be dreary, long, and awkward. I say awkward because it has 4 heroines and a spirit more gloomy than gloom itself. And it can feel that way. They do go on a lot about how miserable they are and they're bored. And I said earlier that, some have difficulty getting past the self-proclaimed misery of the characters. So where does the comedy come from? What makes it funny?
It's so fascinating. He calls it a drama. The Seagull is a comedy, and Uncle Vanya is scenes from country life, and then The Cherry Orchard is a vaudeville or farce. And so this is the one that's the most ostensibly serious in tone. He said that about it. And he said the thing about gloominess. I do think that, as with any artist, take what he says about his own work with a pinch of salt. He's often so conceitedly self-deprecating. It's kind of funny, but also genuinely very modest. But when I was translating it, I was sort of adamant that it wasn't funny. It's not like The Cherry Orchard, in that The Cherry Orchard has gags, it has moments of wordplay, it has a bunch of pratfalls and physical comedy in that play.
But is there comedy in this play?
Well, so in this play, I think the comedy is much more subtle. There aren't jokes per se, but I think the laughter that arises in this play is a different kind of laughter. It so often seems to me it's a laughter of surprise when the characters say something strangely blunt, or, as you point out, this kind of not really responding to each other can create this sort of dissonance that's often surprising. It's a laughter of recognition, to feel like he so truthfully distilled some kind of awkwardness in an interaction. And it's also often, I think, a laughter of a kind of discomfort. The scene between Masha and Vashinin in Act 2, where he professes his love for her, it's very direct, it's very erotic. And I think when the audience is experiencing that, the first thing that often happens, there's an uncomfortable laughter. Chekhov is not wild or stop-hard. He's not asking the audience to collude with him and to observe his own witty dialogue. It's always from the point of view of these human beings. And so often the laughter is just this surprising thing that happens in the moment. And I kind of love that. He's very adamant that the tone is light as well. I always feel like the stage direction to Chebutikin in Act 4, he says, Chebutikin's in a benevolent mood, which he maintains for the entire act. He's very adamant that this character, who's pronouncing perhaps the most nihilistic viewpoint at the end, is filled with lightness in the playing, because he does not want the gloom of the themes to overwhelm the whole thing. I mean, it's kind of gilding the lily if you play these things too gloomily. So I think leaning into his dissonance and playing the lightness of it and the speed of it allows us to take on board those ideas in, I think, the kind of ambivalent, contradictory way which Chekhov wants us to receive them, rather than sentimentalizing them. I mean, despite the fact that the end of the play, I think, is very sad, he's so clearly anti-bourgeois sentimentality. The bit in Act 4 where Irina gives a speech about how terrible her life is, and it's underscored by the Maiden's Prayer, which is a piece of popular music from the time that Chekhov clearly loathed, and indeed the characters on stage clearly loathe. And it's this sort of ironic commentary on melodrama. It's another quote-unquote postmodern touch.
I would say that actually being melodramatically miserable can be very funny, as Masha is in The Seagull, for example. And here it's so over the top that it can be funny. And you're right that the disconnects in language, we haven't mentioned him, and he's a more minor character. So Leone, everything he says is completely ludicrous, anarchic and surreal.
Yeah.
But even the dark stuff can be funny. Actually, what you said, that exchange between Masha and Vershinin, she starts saying, stop, you can't say these things. And then she sort of goes, carry on.
Yeah, she doesn't sort of, she literally says stop, and then she says, no, do it. She turns on a sixpence. It's incredible.
And also, there's a lovely line I laughed out loud. When she first meets Vershinin, she's on her way out the door. She says, I'm going home. And then he starts talking, and she just announces, I'm staying for lunch. And the clear indication is that, oh, okay, Vershinin's here. This is more interesting. I'm staying.
Yeah, incredible economy. It's 4 words, and it's completely altered her trajectory as a character through that first act. It's amazing.
Again, I may be perverse here, but I found it even darkly funny when the assembled folk are just passing time playing cards, drinking tea, and Vershinin tells Masha that his wife has just tried to overdose again, so he won't stay for tea. I don't know why the contrast between them having tea and his wife has just tried to overdose again. Why should that be funny?
As we say, I think this complexity, this sort of contradiction, the paradoxes in the character which allow them to feel like real human beings, which is why people are so fascinated by them, or of the actors to play them. His beautiful, heartfelt philosophizing, his like genuine romantic nature contrasted with this horrible callousness that he displays towards his wife, who is attempting to kill herself.
Yes.
And then arguably even worse than that, although less funny on a kind of line-by-line way, he then turns up again 20 minutes later and says, sorry, it was all fine, she didn't actually die, I'm back, I'm here to hang out with you again, clearly looking for Masha, she's gone. And then he tries to enlist Masha's husband Kaligin to go out for a drink with him. It's amazing how callous and heartless that gesture is, but at the same time we see that he has a heart.
He behaves very badly towards them.
To his family, to the Prozorovs, yeah. He enlists Olga to look after his kids. It's kind of incredible.
Yes, there's not a lot of moral integrity on his part. His philosophizing is sort of pretentious and he's a bit of a windbag, but there's some elements of truth in it.
He's a romantic.
And Masha falls for it. It's a performative sort of energy.
It's interesting you say performative. I think that is exactly right. I think that's another reason why these characters are so wonderful and complicated, is because the characters themselves are performing. They're not just characters living embodied by actors who are performing. They are aware of themselves. It's like T.S. Eliot talking about Shakespeare talks about these self-dramatizing characters, and I think that's what the characters do here as well. It's another part of why they speak so strangely. Someone came up to me at the interval and said, they really overshare, don't they? And I think, obviously, again, oversharing is a very modern idea, but they do. They will just say exactly what's on their mind. They will tell an anecdote about the past at seemingly no provocation. But I think this is because they're sort of creating themselves, or trying to create themselves as people in public, or in the small public space of this living room. And the irony of the disconnect between how they are trying to create themselves and what we, the audience, already know about them is another brilliant thing that creates tension and humor and surprise in the play.
Can we talk a little bit about these individual characters? One of the things that underlines all of this, as it does in other Chekhov's plays, is disappointment in love. Everyone seems to be in love with the wrong person.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's sort of anatomizing, without trying to sound too much like a a Marxist about it. He's anatomizing this bourgeois society where marriage is such a crucial thing in human relationships. The way that acts as the thing which then binds the family and therefore creates sources of tension within the household is so crucial to what he's doing. But yeah, you've got various of them in love with Irina. You've got Chebutikin, who may be Irina's father, who also seems like a suitor, but seems like it's a more paternal thing. You've got, although Masha is married to Kaligin, she's having the affair with Vashinin. Meanwhile, it's clear that there's some sort of frisson between Kaligin and Olga, and that actually, I think the audience generally does see that maybe Kaligin, who in his optimistic, bumbling learnedness is naturally a much better suit for somebody like Olga than for the more spiritual, romantic,
spirited,
passionate Masha.
Yeah, he says at one stage, didn't he, I could have married you, or I should have married you.
Yeah, he says I should have.
I should have married you if not for Masha, which is sort of a qualified should have, but...
Yeah, well, he said, I often think if it wasn't for Masha, so it's would have, I often think if it wasn't for Masha, I would have married you. And then the next thing he says is, I'm fed up. And that I'm fed up, again, this tiny little phrase in the Russian as well. So much he's talking about his entire life. He knows that she's having this affair. In those 7 letters, you get so much of this man's soul. And you see that there could be some sort of real possibility for connection with Olga, but because of where they are, because of the fact that he's married to Masha, it's not possible. And that's so sad. Even in the kind of tiniest of interactions as well, I love Fedotic. He's also a suitor for Irina, who brings her these little presents throughout the play. And then at the end of the play, when it's clear that Irina's marrying Tuzenbach, he gives his last present to Kaligin instead. And again, that's a heartbreaking moment, like just a little stage direction. But that closes off his story so beautifully and so musically.
Again, you're saying that Chekhov is complicated because Kaligin, in a lot of ways, is pretty pathetic. He's boring and pretentious, clearly small in mind and ambition, and a bit pathetic in just taking all that Masha hits him with. He talks about her all the time. She treats him with disdain, but he keeps praising her and saying how much he loves her, and literally says a number of times, I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy. The more he says it, the less he believes it. It's hard to watch, and yet, in some weird way, we also respect him in the end, his tenacity, his endurance in his love for Masha, possibly. His acceptance of her after Vashinin is gone, strangely, seems okay.
Yeah, he stays there for her, and that's wonderful. And then he puts on a fake beard, which is, again, one of the most beautiful moments of the play. And this is one of the extraordinary things that Chekhov is doing tonally, this kind of chiaroscuro that he creates of emotion. In that moment, it's the most heartbreaking and sad thing and the funniest thing at the same time. I think he's interested ultimately in where that vanishing point is, where comedy and tragedy are the same thing. And so that's why it's great for these bits to be funny, because they're also so sad. I love Kaligin because Irina says he thinks he's the cleverest man in the world, but he's not. He's the kindest man in the world, but he's not the cleverest. And then at the end of the play, one of the last thing he says to Irina is, I'm very, very clever. I'm cleverer than most people. But then the thing that he displays at the end is his kindness again. And I find that so beautiful and lovely. But also because it's Chekhov, the way that he cajoles Masha, for instance, in Act 1, when he's telling her that she has to go to this party, it's kind of coercive. It's slightly bullying. And then in Act 3, another of my favourite moments, where she tells him 3 times that the situation with Andrei is upsetting her. She uses the word upset 3 times, and he refuses to engage with it. He's just like, why are you worried about that? Stop worrying about that. And in that moment, he's being a terrible husband. And so he's not this sort of stoical saint.
Oh, no. He's not very likable a lot of the time.
And his kind of windbaggery, of course, also offsets this immense kindness. So it's so complicated.
And to some degree, you don't really blame Masha for her frustrations.
No, she gets married when she's 18.
The scales have long since fallen from her eyes. He is boring, and he's underachieved. And it reminded me, her disdain and their relationship reminded me of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, weirdly, of Martha and her unhappiness with her underachieving husband, another academic underachiever.
Oh, yeah. Brilliant.
The anger as well.
Well, the fact that at the end you see that they're kind of locked in this dance, as Martha and George are.
Yes.
I think that's really true. Whatever Beckett says, alone together.
Yeah. You mentioned that line about him saying I'm clever, but he goes on to say, but that's not where happiness lies. So he even understands that whatever he thinks of his cleverness, that's not won him love or happiness.
No.
Let's talk about Masha and Vershinin's relationship. We know that this is doomed from the start, don't we? He's never leave his disturbed wife and his darling daughters. And when they leave, it's pretty soul-destroying for her. Granted, she's committing adultery, and we watch the pain of that with Kuligin, as we just described. But somehow Chekhov's pretty forgiving of these sorts of things as well, because he's shown us how unhappy Masha is. And therefore, when he's leaving, it's soul-destroying for her. She talks about when your happiness only comes in snatches, in tiny little pieces, then you lose it. That's hard too.
It's really hard. I mean, I think the thing you said about forgiveness, I think is really true. I think he forgives everybody. That's another thing that's completely wonderful about him as a dramatist. He never lets them off the hook, but he's endlessly forgiving and endlessly loving of them as people and understanding of their frailty. And Masha, who is deeply unhappy, it's very easy to look through this play and see the various mental health disorders that each of these characters possesses as a modern person. Chekhov was a doctor, worked for most of his life until he was no longer physically able to as a doctor as well as a writer, and he also conducted a census on Sakhalin Island in the Far East. So even if these things weren't diagnosed in the same way, he would have seen so many different kinds of people with so many different kinds of disorder. It's very clear that Masha is some kind of manic depressive. Solioni, without wanting to limit it, is some sort of neurodivergence, is on the autistic spectrum in some way. That feels very clear as a modern audience member. I love the sense, and my wife said this after seeing the show, that a lot of Natasha's behaviour seems to be motivated by a kind of postpartum depression. And Natasha, who's often thought of as the kind of villain, looking at it from that angle, which I can completely see as a reading of the play, it's sort of wonderful to see how Chekhov has created these people as so full, the way that they inhabit the world, despite the fact that they're often inhabiting it in an unusual way. He said in a letter to Olga Nipper, really sad people don't act really sad all the time. They get suddenly angry and they whistle. Again, that's obviously what Masha does, and I think that's so much more complicated and human in just those few brushstrokes. He's created this full person with those gestures, with those personality traits.
The idea about Natasha is brilliant because she comes across, in simple terms, as the villain of the piece. You know, she's selfish and Philistine, and she treats the servants badly. She takes over the house and virtually kicks them out, in a sense. She's pretty ruthless to her husband, carries on an affair. Actually, that's a really interesting turn of her obsessive pride in her children. It feels pretty obnoxious, but actually, with that lens of postpartum depression, that becomes so much more credible in some way. And also the fact, initially, you sort of feel a little bit sorry for her when she's scorned by the sisters and their snobbishness. She comes in, she's wearing the wrong thing, and they don't think she's good enough for Andrei. So part of what drives her maybe even is some response to that. Maybe it's not as conscious as revenge, but it comes out a little bit like that because there's a detail where she actually tells Irina, I think it is, that the belt she is wearing doesn't suit her, which is an echo of her being criticized for her fashion choice. That's later when she's now in complete control of the house.
Yeah, she's an amazing character. She's definitely a victim of their bullying in the beginning. She's a different social class. She's from a kind of mercantile, nascent bourgeoisie class, whereas the sisters are more kind of gentry as children of a high-ranking officer. So they look down on her, they're horrible to her. Natasha's moment of deepest cruelty, or the very shocking thing she does when she tells the old nanny, Anfisa, to get out, and how dare you sit down in my presence. Sure, that is very shocking and very cruel, but we have also witnessed Masha being very, very rude to Anfisa, and Masha is also extremely rude to Natasha. So I think Natasha is so much more complicated. It's also fascinating how she, as the representative of the bourgeoisie, at the end has managed to make this bourgeois household work for her in this new, strange sort of assembly where she's got the two fathers of her various children in the house kind of okay with each other. So this is Protopopov, with whom she's having an affair, and Andrei, with whom she has the two children. Probably the first child is Andrei's, probably the second is Protopopov's, although we don't know the parentage. She's got these two guys doing the childcare for her while she does the sort of landscape gardening. It's amazing that she's able to make this structure work for herself by completely taking it apart.
She definitely comes out on top, ruling the roost. Can we talk a bit about Irina and Tuzenbach and their relationship? So Irina has this romantic dream of going to Moscow, where partly she imagines she would find love. And she tries to hold on to that dream, but gradually begins to believe that it won't happen, and finally resigns herself to marrying Tusenbach, whom she doesn't love. He, of course, has loved her and pursued her for years. And then we have the denouement of their relationship, which is shattering. It's one of the most poignant scenes, I think, in all of drama. It's the day before they are to be wed, and yet something has occurred. Can you talk us through that scene and how that unfolds?
Yeah, so Irina is about to marry Tusenbach and move away with him to a village near a brick factory where Tusenbach will work at this brick factory and Irina will teach at the local school there. And so she's sort of resigned herself to a life that in some ways is a sort of mirroring of both of her sisters. She will be the housewife that Masha is and the teacher that Olga is. But then the day before that, there's been some kind of altercation between Solyony, who is also a suitor for Irina, and has told her in Act 2 that he will kill anybody who stands in his way of getting her. Tusenbach has also prophetically said that he would give his life for Irina in Act 3. And so just before the soldiers leave, there is going to be a duel. Solyony's challenged Tusenbach to a duel, and Tusenbach has accepted and is going to fight this duel in a way that is extremely ambivalent and interesting, and you wonder if on some level he knows he's going to die and he's getting his wish of giving his life for Irina, but also again this idea of the internal and the external circumstances. There's nothing he can do about this. His relationship with Solyony has a real sense of tragedy to it. From the beginning, he's known that he's violent, that he's cruel. The two of them are sort of locked together in this dance to the death. And in this extraordinary scene, as you say, one of the best two-handed scenes I think ever written, Irina wants Tusenbach to say something about what's about to happen, and Tusenbach refuses, and Irina oddly doesn't push him. And they have this moment where they both know he's going off to die, and then he turns around and says to her, "I haven't had any coffee, will you tell him to make me some?" And then he leaves. Irina stands in silence. And then at the very end of the play, Chebotikin, who has been presiding over this duel as a doctor, tells the sisters that Tusenbach has been killed in this duel. As expected, the more experienced, more violent Solyony has taken out the more kindly, benevolent Tusenbach, that Irina's future has suddenly changed, and she's now going to go off and work in this school on her own. And it's really heartbreaking, but as we've been saying all along, it's also full of ambivalence and mystery and contradiction. Maybe actually Tusenbach's death, because she didn't love him, that's what she says in this amazing scene. She says, "I don't love you."
That's not in my power, she says. That's not in my power to love her.
Yeah, it's not in my power. I dreamt about it day and night, but now my heart is like some expensive piano and someone's locked it up and lost the key. And he knows that he is giving his life to this person who doesn't love him. He says that's the thing that won't let him sleep. That's the thing he's most worried about, is that she doesn't love him and she's about to give her whole life to him. And so there's a sense as well that in his death there's a kind of liberation for her.
And as you said, is there some possible subconscious idea that he is walking to his death, as he knows he's going to be at a disadvantage in this duel? He must know that. And that's betrayed in this conversation that he has before he goes. He talks about the papers he's left as well. And that line, that final line of, "I didn't have any coffee this morning. Will you ask them to make me some?" Some idea that I might be back, but, Chekhov's gun's been introduced, so to speak. We all think this is likely to go badly wrong, and he knows that that's possible.
Yeah, he says very, very clearly, "I think if I die, I'll still be part of this life somehow or other." Obviously, on some level, Tusenbach doesn't want to die, but on another level, he does, and it's all about where you position him on that continuum. That's interesting. It's also maybe my favourite moment in the play, where he looks at the trees and says, "It's the first time in my life I'm looking at these trees, and everything's looking back at me with curiosity, and it's waiting." And you get a sense that he's lifted the veil a little bit and can see the audience in a way that's so subtle and beautiful. And then Chekhov takes and develops for Trofimov's speech at the end of Act 2 in the Cherry Orchard, where he talks about in each tree there's a face of a human being. It's so wonderful that this man, just on the precipice of something, he can see his life.
Well, it's a connection to life and death, isn't it? Some understanding that there's a spirit in nature that he may be part of. When he dies, that he'll still be taking part in life, as he describes it, as part of something larger, as part of nature in some way. It's ambiguous, but very poetic and quite a stunning image. A sort of desperate attempt to come to terms with his own death, obliteration. And as you said, it's fascinating the way Irina does not press the point. There's very cleverly set up, not being explicit about what's really gone on for a while in the town and why this has come to a head and that they're going to duel. But she must have some idea, and she won't acknowledge it. But then when he presses her about love, she won't also lie and say, yes, I love you, knowing he's going off to do this. It's heartbreaking, that line that it's not in my power. I just can't love you. I don't have it. I don't feel it.
Yeah. And then that amazing bit just after that, where he says, say something, and then there's a pause, and then he says, say something, and then she says, what is there to say, what? And he says, something, and then she says, stop it. It's like, in those 4 lines, it's just sort of the entire of their relationship somehow, even though it's 4 lines and it's hardly any words.
She won't satisfy him. She won't answer it. She can't.
No.
She can't do it.
Yeah, because she can't.
Let's talk about the ending. He creates this sense of foreboding of the inevitable tragedy, and it's even more powerful in a sense when it comes for being a muffled, far-away gunshot. So those on the stage, I think, do not even react, but we know what it means. And then I was also struck when they are told, isn't there a slightly surprising lack of response to the tragedy of Tusenbach? It seems to be all about their own plight.
Yeah, the muffled faraway gunshot is amazing because, obviously that stage direction is for the audience, but he doesn't say whether the characters react to it on stage, and so I think that gives a real openness to how you stage it. In this production at the Globe, Kaligin is having a hint of it, but the rest of them seem in their own little world at that moment, and that's really fascinating. What do they think it is? Seemingly, that is the gunshot that kills Tusenbach, we presume, but we don't know. That's never said.
There's an inevitability here.
We know what it is. And then when the news is brought back on, I do think that is partly a handbrake turn stylistically that Chekhov makes at the end of the play. They kind of move into this rhapsodic kind of lyrical mode as they try to console themselves with this music. It's all there in the given circumstances. You can psychologize it, but also it's for them to move into this place where they can think about the future and try to make some sort of meaning out of it. It does require this pivot into something that feels more symbolist or lyrical.
But I was going to stop you there because you said very specifically earlier that Chekhov was absolutely determined to avoid sentimentality. And I wondered what's going on here. It does, as you say, turn kind of lyrical. The 3 sisters are left standing together, nestled into one another. They're left alone, as Masha would have it, with only each other for support. She is alone because her lover is gone, completely disregarding the existence of her husband. Irina has lost her fiancé, and Olga has never had anyone. Yet they vow to go on, to start our lives again, to work. Our lives aren't finished yet. It almost seems like if we wait just a little bit longer, we'll know what we're living for. And Olga returns to the idea that their suffering will be turned into joy for those who come after us. Happiness and peace will flourish on the earth. So are we to take these final declarations as symbol of hope, of the gay affirmation of life, as one critic put it?
Oh, it's Chekhov again. It's so open. It could be so many different things, and we can't ever do the full contradictory resonance of it justice in a single performance. I think in the music of the play, this idea that she comes to, "Если бы знать, if only we knew," becomes her rallying cry against Chebutikin, who is counterpointing her in that moment with singing Tarara Bumbie, this low popular song, and saying makes no difference. And what Olga does, it kind of extraordinarily, as the sort of final first violin solo at the end, she synthesizes and develops the ideas of Vashinin about what will happen after we've gone. But she doesn't just say, like he does, that people in the future will not think about us or not care about us or think that we were stupid or a bit weird for living how we live now. She says that they will remember us with kind words and they will bless us. That word bless is so extraordinary, the idea that we're not doing this for nothing now. It won't be forgotten, that actually we will be blessed for this. She kind of comes to this amazing idea just at the end.
Yeah, but sorry to interrupt, she also says in the very same speech that they will be forgotten. And as you've been saying all along, it's ambivalent, is it not?
Of course, of course.
Because it feels more like the irony of hope, that we cannot live without hope, but it is the hope that kills us. And actually, the last lines of the play, she asks the questions, why do we suffer in our lifetimes? What is our purpose? But her last line is, if only we knew. Isn't that not, in fact, an admission that she will never know?
I mean, it's the same sort of idea, right, for me, as like when people say that Beckett's work is pessimistic. I think it's optimistic because it's saying, in a way that I think genuinely is then taken up by the existentialists, actually it is this desire to know. It's the being present and active in your search for the knowledge of that. That is the thing that gives you the meaning. As you point out, there are numerous things that undermine that even in the speech. And also, of course, counterpointed with Chebotikin's Makes No Difference, you kind of have a major and a minor chord going on at the end of the play in a way that creates sort of a wholeness, but also a dissonance in that final moment, in that final chord. So I don't think it's straightforwardly happy. And, this can all be played as this massive denial. But I do think it's like she's found that in the struggling, in a similar way to Sonia at the end of Uncle Vanya, although more developed now, I think, that actually in the being present with each other and trying to live a life that is meaningful because it's yours and because it's now is some kind of consolation for the future, despite all of the horror and the terror and the difficulty of being alive, that as long as we can talk about it, I can't go on, I'll go on. It's that sort of idea that she's giving us at the end, that actually the search, the desire for meaning is itself part of the aim.
Like Sonia and Uncle Vanya, they go on enduring. Enduring was the word that kept coming back to me. But there's something more than that wanting to know, that commitment to saying our life is not over.
Yeah, she says we're going to live. Будем жить. It's so wonderful. Well, the others say we need to live, and there's so much of we need to live, we need to work. And then at the end, she says, будем жить. We're going to live. You're laughing, and in some of the it's silly, like, no, unless you kill yourself, it is.
I'm laughing because I love the fact you've just given us the little snippet of Russian. So it comes back to the beginning and your role in translating this. Thank you, Rory. It's been a fantastic conversation. What a rich play. We spent quite a long time, but I still feel like there's more we could scrape out of it. But before I let you go, however, one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or actually, more importantly, one that's just a personal favorite, perhaps. So is there a play you might volunteer for listeners that you love?
I was going to say the last play I saw was The Little Foxes by Lillian Hellman at the Young Vic, and I had no knowledge of the play beforehand. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I thought it was completely fascinating, and only found out afterwards that Hellman edited a collection of Chekhov's letters, and there's so much that's Chekhovian in the play. Like with Three Sisters, it's in fact set in the same year as Three Sisters. They're both 1900, and it feels like it's not just State of the Nation, it's looking both back and forward through the whole American century, written in 1939, in a similar way as I think Chekhov's plays look back and forward. So yeah, I was really bowled over to go into the room having no knowledge of this classic and then just experience it moment to moment. I thought it was great, and really recommend people read it or go and see if it's on again.
Okay, great. That's a great recommendation. I don't know it either, but I will look it up now. Thank you very much for that recommendation. And thank you for joining me, Rory. It's great to meet you. Rory's translation of Three Sisters, directed by Caroline Steinbeis, continues in the Sam Wanamaker Theatre at Shakespeare's Globe in London until the 19th of April. As the curtain falls on the three sisters left behind by the departing battalion, and by their unrealized plans and dreams, it seems clear that Olga's anguished plea to know why she suffers will not be answered. But here's a question. As we file out of the theatre, back into our own lives, do we feel gloomy, enervated by the philosophical despair we've been exposed to? Yes, we have to deal with our own disappointments and failings, and we also struggle with finding definitive meaning in existence. But I contend that through the empathy we feel for the universal human experience of these characters, and an accompanying appreciation of the artist who created it, we are inspired to cherish the continuing life we do have. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.